chemically related to some other plants we're going to talk about, but realize that this is a tree. So this is something that is kind of unique and different. And it comes from northern Brazil. What's interesting is that this has actually been around for a really long time. So you actually dig back and find the Copaiba essential oil in the Copaiba tree, and dealing with things like indigenous forms of taking care of themselves. So when you think about like the ancient Amazons and some of the medicines that they would use, this was one of theirs. Most specifically, the one that's noted the most from early explorers was actually used for wound care. Somebody would get hurt, this is the thing that they would use as a balm or a salve or what have you, so that the person would heal from that. So one of the uses of the essential oil is actually for the face. So that's one thing that they've mentioned. And I realize that oftentimes when we talk about different essential oils and how good they are for skin, it's not uncommon for those to come up like, oh, and it's, of course, it's great for your skin, what have you. But realize that Copaiba's, one of their original uses of this oil has always been for the skin, and especially for taking care of healing wounds and things like that. So also useful for antibacterial, antifungal things. And we'll look more into that in a little bit. So the other thing you'll often hear with this is its connections to CBD. So we're going to talk a little bit about what some of these acronyms are, just to make sure we're all on the same page together. So along with that, we're also going to be talking about something called the endocannabinoid system. And I just wanted to mention a thing about the name. So Dr. Hill has a talk. It's online. It's just under 12 minutes long, that talks a little bit about Copaiba and different things along with it. And he kind of makes overtures about names, but I'm going to be a little bit more overt just because since I teach for a living, I get kind of used to having the license to make fun of names. So first of all, it's called the endocannabinoid system because we discovered it existed by looking at what cannabis, marijuana, actually does. So that is why we know the system exists. However, that's about it. Like that's why we know it's a thing. You don't have to have any sort of connections to marijuana to take use of it. It just happens to be how we found out about the interconnection. So just two quick examples of reasons of how science names things poorly occasionally. So when you look at how plants take in light to make energy, if you just look at this diagram from left to right, you'll notice photosystem 2 is on the left, and it comes first, and then photosystem 1's on the right. So that's because we discovered photosystem 1 first, but it actually comes second. We discovered photosystem 2 later, but it's actually first, and we've just never renamed it. So we've known about the correct order of these two things for a very long time, but nobody renames them. So these have just always been backwards. We often name things for historical reasons, not necessarily the best of reasons, but that's where it comes from. So it is the endocannabinoid system. And again, we discovered it because we were trying to look more into what cannabis does, but that's about where that one ends. So with that, the endocannabinoid system has two different kinds of receptors. So just kind of a reminder of when we say receptors, what we mean is they are presences on the outside of cells so that parts of our body can get information from one part of our body to another. So basically that way the whole system can talk to each other. So that way when you have things like a cold, and your body is trying to tell you that you are sick, you get multiple symptoms from that. You don't just have fatigue, but you're tired, and you have a runny nose, and maybe your appetite's a bit off. All of those different parts of your body have to communicate and talk to each other. And receptors are how the body does that. It's the receiving end, which is why they're called receptors. So they're receiving some sort of signal. So to go along with the endocannabinoid system are cannabinoids. Again, kind of an unfortunate name or classification, but that's just what the group of chemicals is called. So you either have things chemicals that are going to work with the first receptor, things that are going to work with the second receptor, or things that are going to work with both. There's CB1 receptor, which is mainly in the brain and the central nervous system. So that one tends to be the psychotropic effects, tends to be CB1. CB2 is more in the endocrine system and the immune system. It also is a little bit in the brain, but not nearly as much. So we talk about CB1 receptors, talking about the brain, the central nervous system. When we talk about CB2 receptors, those are going to be the endocrine system, which this is going to be kind of your glandular system. So when you're trying to think about how different hormones work, how we grow, various things like that, regulations to control appetite, stress levels, things like that. That's our endocrine system. And this is going to be where the Copaiba comes back, is in our CB2 receptors. So when you think about things affecting the endocrine system and helping us through things like stress or difficult times, then this is where the Copaiba is going to come in, is with these CB2 receptors and helping us with the endocrine system. It's also going to help us with the immune system and that immune support. And as far as location for where your immune system is, I typically think of your immune system as being, well, kind of everywhere. Anytime that your body has to fight off any sort of illness, your immune system is wherever that needs to be. So your immune system is like kind of everywhere all at once. And again, your endocrine system is looking at a lot of glands, hormones, what's going on. And so these CB2 receptors, those ones in green, are the ones that our Copaiba essential oil is going to affect. So just coming back, because I like chemistry, so of course I had to put these in here. Good boy. When you're talking about things, again, going back to kind of where all these things are stemming from in this word of cannabis, realize that there is this compound of THC, which that's the compound that actually gets people high. That one is all having to do with the CB1 receptor. It's also what they call very tightly bound. It's exactly what it sounds like as far as the molecule doesn't let go very well. So when you talk about the effects you actually get from smoking marijuana, those are longer lasting and they're a stronger effect because of this tighter bind, because this molecule is not going to let go, and the areas it's not letting go of very well are in the brain and the central nervous system. They are also in the gut, which is why you get the munchies, but usually the emphasis is on the effects in the brain. The other oil you may have heard of is CBD, or just cannabinoid, which this one actually does affect a different kind of receptor. You can actually see how similar these two compounds are, yet they affect completely different receptors. The other thing with CBD oil, and while that one's often touted as being helpful and useful, is because it's weakly bound, so it doesn't have nearly as drastic as an effect. And the one that we've been talking about is that Copaiba, which main active ingredient is abbreviated BCP for beta caryophyllene. And again, that's a weakly bound one. That weakly bound often seems like, oh, but it's weak. How could we possibly want something that's weak? Realize when we say weakly bound, that's a nice way of saying that it's not going to override something that our body needs to happen. So when you ever see that weakly bound, that's not an indicator of the compound's ability to affect us. It's more of saying that it's not going to try to take over what we need to happen, who we really are. It's going to work better in harmony with our bodies. So whenever you see that weakly bound, just realize that weakly bound is supposed to be a good thing. Just kind of going back, that whenever you hear people talk about CBD or THC, both of those compounds do come from marijuana. Those are coming from hemp. Those are coming from something in that family of that particular grass, which is part of why they can either be controversial or why you often have people get kind of hyped up or more excited about them, is because they've got those strong connections back to that particular plant. The other thing is that because they're both coming from the same organism, even though you have usually some varieties that have much more of the CBD or much less of the THC. Because they come from the same plant, they're both being produced, which again is one of the reasons why Copaiba is such an excellent addition to our essential oil family, because that is coming from a completely different organism. It's not a grass, it's not a little bush thing, it's a tree. So because it is a completely different organism, you don't have to worry about, like, well, is the government going to have some issue with this because of trace amounts of THC? And the answer is no, because with Copaiba, there is none. So you don't, so it's a completely different organism, completely different oil. It has some chemical connections in the receptors and where this might go into. But again, you can even look at how similar the compounds are and realize that they are drastically different from each other. And a lot of things come either out of Brazil, or they are coming out specifically looking at wound care. So the current community is very interested in some of the indigenous people's kind of claim of this organism. The reason why I have to grab this is because I wanted to point out the fact that we've got studies that actually show that Copaiba is actually good to inhibit those C. albicans, which often are those forms of called C. albicans, the yeasts, all things we don't like. So they are actually Copaiba has actually been shown to be a good inhibitor of a variety of different fungi, as well as bacteria, as well as protozoa. So it's excellent in inhibiting a variety of different things. So good against fungus and against bacteria. So this is kind of bringing back some of the things from doTERRA, that it is helpful with things that are calming due to that idea of working with the endocrine system. But again, from Brazil, and does have a nice thing is it has a lot of the beta-caryophyllene, because that is going to be that more soothing compound, and that's the majority of what the oil itself is. So unlike somewhere, great, this is my oil, but how much of the good stuff do I get? You actually get a significant portion of the chemistry that we're interested in. So if you are going to be looking for literature on this, something that I was finding as I was going around is that a lot of it does come from Brazil, since that's where the trees are themselves. And a lot of it's going to be aimed at some of the claims from folklore, as well as some of the physical attributes. So going to things like wound care. Wound care is something that the scientific community can understand really well. So we tend to focus on things like that. Trying to get into more of those soothing and calming effects are where you're going to have to rely more on anecdotal evidence. So while the Copaiba oil is really well known for having a very calming effect on people, that's something that's going to wind up going back to your folklore. So just like we know that lavender is calming, we also know that Copaiba is also very calming. Or church, because what people always want is they want to know, where are my human trials? Well, if you've got the funding, I'm sure we could do that. But this is oftentimes a game where the funding becomes problematic. So this oil has been around for quite a while and has seen a fair amount of uses in its life. I was really surprised with how well known it is in Brazil. It is one of those that, yeah, they've known about it for a long time, and it was one of those things that as soon as we had Europeans settling in Brazil, this was something that we've known about for a very, very long time. And I think the thing that I just had wanted to emphasize is because everybody gets so caught up in that cannabis name, was like, but it's a completely different thing. Like, I understand that it's somewhat related and it's affecting some of the receptors, but it is in fact a completely different thing.
I think the difference is the calming, but you don't get the up from it. You don't get high on it.
Exactly. You cannot get high from it. It doesn't affect the same receptors at all, and there's no potential possibility of any trace amounts. So where with CBD, you might say, oh, but what if there's some trace amount of your THC compound that gets you high? And it's like, well, it's from a tree that doesn't produce that other compound, so you can't get high on it, because it's not that compound that gets you high is not produced by that tree. So it's not in the bottle. It can't be.